So we're going to spend some time talking about the classification of life on Earth. So in the 18th century, this guy, Carol Linnaeus, developed a system of binomial nomenclature whereby each species was given a two-part name, which was the genus and species. Okay, so for us, we are Homo sapiens. Our genus is Homo. Our species is Sapiens. The domesticated dog is Canis familiaris. Canis is the genus, familiaris is the species. Canis lupus is given to wolves. Canis is again the genus, lupus is the species. So Canis is the name shared by all dogs and gray wolves. And familiaris and lupus are names given to individual species. And as you may have figured out from the last video, this can be problematic because dogs and wolves can interbreed, and so it's kind of like, well, are these separate species actually, or like what's going on here? What do you call a hybrid between those two? So anyway, the point I'm trying to get across here is there is a genus species name theoretically for every species on the planet. So taxonomy, or the science of classification, sets out to organize all species into 8 basic categories: species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain. All right. Domain is the most inclusive category and species is the least. So there are only 3 domains, whereas there are millions of species. Okay. Organisms in each category make up a taxon. So if you were talking about all animals, that would be a taxon. If you were talking about all mammals, that would be a taxa. I'm sorry. If you were talking about every organism within, like familiaris, every organism within the dogs, that would be a taxa. And we have this idea of systematics, which is a system of classification that tries to organize everything into their evolutionary relatedness, or they try to place them into these various categories. Species in the same genus would be very closely related to one another, and they would have a very recent common ancestor. So if you go up a level from genus to family, things in the same family would share a common ancestor, but further back than things that might be in the same genus. And so this is just kind of looking at a cat. So here you have the animal kingdom, which has everything from this worm to a fish to a bear to it's like an ocelot or something. I'm embarrassed. It's probably going to be something else, like a raccoon. I just can't see it. And a cat, you have a lion, you have a mouse, you have a monarch butterfly here. That is the animal kingdom. There's more to it than that. But then if you move down to the phylum level, so kingdom is a broad category. Above this is domain. These would all be eukaryotes, by the way, but kingdom, Animalia. The next is the phylum. These are all chordates. Okay, they started with a notochord at one point in their development, and you'll notice that the worm has now been eliminated from this. The worm is not a chordate, but it is in fact an animal. Moving down to Mammalia. Okay, so everything was chordates up here. Now we're just looking at the mammals, and so we eliminate the fish from this group. Like I said, the further you go up this tree, the more inclusive you become. The further down you go, the more exclusive you become. Then we move on to carnivores, and we eliminate the mouse. Okay, so the mouse is not a carnivore. And then we get to Felidae, and we're getting rid of our bear. This is not in the Felidae family. Cats, kind of in general. And then you get down to Felis, which is the genus. Okay, so this is definitely not a raccoon. So genus is Felis, and then you get down to species, which is Felis domesticata, or the common house cat. Okay, so that's why the system kind of works. So if we were talking about the animal kingdom, this would be a taxa. Okay, anything in the animal kingdom, this is a taxa. This is a group of organisms. You could also say anything in the order Carnivora is a taxa. So all of these are in the same taxa. Any of these levels are a taxa, by the way. And so this is just a way that we have taken and categorized these things based on similarity So down to the very specific individual or the individual species here. So a way you can do this is to use systematics, which puts things into various groupings based on similarities in morphology most of the time. And systematics has evolved into biochemistry, whereby you can look at more specific characteristics that you can't necessarily see. So you can use things like genetics to figure out these systematic problems. You can use things like morphology to figure out these systematic problems. And basically what you're doing is just like what we did in lab, where you're grouping things together based on similarity. So shared ancestry is inferred by a commonality in physical structures, homology. For example, similarity in bone anatomy of the forelimb of a gorilla, a bat, and a whale. So you can use these different things by figuring out what characteristics these things all have in common. Again, we did this in lab today. And you can use these to build these evolutionary relationships. So here is a family tree for mammalian carnivores. These are all mammals, and these are all carnivores. So convergent evolution kind of complicates this picture because, like we saw in class, bats have wings and birds have wings, but they certainly should not be in the same category, right? So because, like we talked about, similar environments causes these things to have similar characteristics, it would be a mistake, though, to put, air-breathing dolphins into the same category as water-breathing fish. So then we have this idea of homology, which we talked about in class. And homology means that these things have similar looking arms because they come from something of a common ancestry. Okay? Similar looking things because they have common ancestry. That is as opposed to analogy. So analogy is something that is going to be one of the products of convergent evolution. Okay? So you have these two unrelated organisms here, but they still have similar looking characteristics. So they're analogous because they look like one another, but they aren't related to one another. So cladistics is this tool for deriving phylogenetic relationships, and you're trying to determine where the common ancestors are, and you're using that to build an evolutionary tree. A cladogram is kind of like one of the things we did today, although technically ours was a phylogeny, but the difference between the two is not super important at this point. But a cladogram is a geographical representation of the evolutionary tree, and it shows diversification events. So here you've got a splitting here between the hagfish and the rest of this group. And what they did was they said, okay, anything that's beyond this point is a tetrapod. Anything beyond this point has 4 legs. Okay, cool. So there's a common ancestor here. Then everything beyond this point has 4 legs. So you've got your lizards up here. And then we're looking at mammals now. So anything beyond this point, anything beyond this common ancestor has mammary glands. They feed their young with milk. Anything beyond here has mammary glands. You get up to this next point here. Here's a common ancestor before carnivorous feeding. So this common ancestor has tetrapod structure. It has mammary glands. And then anything beyond this point is carnivorous. Anything beyond this point is carnivorous. Okay, so you have your lion. So here's our next common ancestor. This common ancestor is a tetrapod. It has mammary glands. Tetrapod means like has 4 legs. It has mammary glands. It feeds its young with milk. It is carnivorous. Okay, all of those characteristics are of a lion and this common ancestor. And then beyond this point is aquatic habitat, which leads us to the seal. So the seal has an aquatic habitat. It is carnivorous. It has mammary glands, and it is indeed a tetrapod. So you use these shared characteristics to build these trees and see where organisms came from, see what their common ancestor looked like. So common ancestors are defined based on characteristics shared by all members in that group. So if we go back to here, everything beyond this point is carnivorous, right? So all of these members of this group are carnivorous. and so therefore was their common ancestor. Descendants are clustered into more selective groupings. Okay, so these things kind of get more and more inclusive as you start getting toward the thing you're trying to study. And derived traits are used to create what's called a clade and are unique to that clade, and clades descended from it. Yeah, this language is a little bit wonky here. So I would just think of it as you're using these common characteristics to build a phylogenetic evolutionary tree, and you can use that to ascertain probably what the common ancestor of each of those groups looks like. The more derived characters any two organisms share, the more recently they will have shared a common ancestor compared to other organisms. So let's go back to that. The lion and the seal share this carnivorous feeding, so they are more closely related to one another than they are to like a lizard. They have a more recent common ancestor. You can wind up with issues with cladistic analysis. Cladistics focuses only on evolutionary relationships, while classical systematics uses phylogenetic evidence along with other information and may give disproportionate rating to some traits relative to others. So again, this is super wordy. I'm not super worried about this stuff. Just kind of know what systematics is and kind of know what cladistics is. And so here is a classical view of our tetrapods over here. And here is a cladistic view of our tetrapods over here. And you can see that these are showing very, very different relationships to one another. These are showing very, very different relationships. Here's how these things are usually viewed. But if you just look at the cladistics, if you look at the shared characteristics, this is actually what you get over here. Which one is right? I don't know. That's a question beyond my pay grade at this point.